In this video, we're going to take a detailed look at the different settings within the record panel and how they affect our MIDI and how it will be recorded, both in loop mode and out of loop mode, as well as several tools that are available to help us record our MIDI within the record panel. And at the end of this tutorial, we'll also take a look at step record. To begin, let's just take a look at how MIDI recording will function in its most basic form and without any special settings. And first, we'll open up the record panel. We can access that by coming to View and then choosing Record Panel here. We can also press Shift, Alt, and R on our keyboard to open it up. Now, having this open is going to give us a visual representation of what the different settings will do, or how they'll basically affect our MIDI recordings when we're recording our song. And as you can see here, we have three main sections. We've got record mode, instrument loop record, and then an area for our instrument recording tools. Now, these last two sections really only pertain to recording in loop mode, so we're not going to worry about these at the moment, and we're just going to focus on how Studio One works when we're recording MIDI directly in without making any adjustments. Now, if you haven't already opened or accessed your record panel and made any adjustments here, this is what you are going to see. The only thing that we have active is record mix within the instrument loop record. And for our first example, we're not even going to worry about that because, again, when we're just doing basic MIDI recording, we only want to think about the record mode here. So what is the default behavior of recording MIDI? Let's just start by recording a basic 4-bar melody. I've got a presence active here on this instrument track and a simple piano patch loaded, so I'll go ahead and record that 4-bar melody. So as expected, this is nothing new, I'm sure, to most of you. We've got our basic MIDI recording captured, and we can see our MIDI notes visually within our MIDI part here, and we can even double click on this to access the editor and see the MIDI notes here that we can also move, edit, and also see them in relation to the piano roll here. And I'll just F2 to close out that editor. And at this point, I'm just going to return to the beginning of the track, do another pass of recording. We are not in loop mode. If you just take notice up here within our ruler, loop has not been activated or set up. So we're just going to record directly over that first passage. I'm going to play an octave up of the same melody. Now we can see that the new MIDI notes are simply added to our MIDI part, and our original performance is still retained. We also did hear it play back as we were recording. And so this is the basic functionality of recording MIDI within Studio One. If you haven't made any adjustments, whatever MIDI part that you have within your song, if you press record, it's the new MIDI data or the new MIDI performance is simply going to be added to that part. Nothing will be replaced, and you will hear back as long as you have monitoring engaged your original or previous performances as well. So now the first change that we can make is by activating replace. So I'll go ahead and select that. I'll come back to the beginning of our track, and then I'm going to play another octave up the same melody, and let's see what happens here. Now, as I'm sure most of you figured out, that replace is going to just overwrite, so to speak, that previous MIDI information. It is nowhere to be found. If I go ahead and move this MIDI part, it's not underneath. It has been erased. And if you also noticed, as I was recording, that previous performance was silent and we could not hear that. So we're basically just replacing what we previously had recorded, and we're not going to hear that playback as we're recording. So now I'm going to come back to the beginning of the track once again, deactivate replace, and let's check out the next button that we have here, takes to layers. I'll go ahead and engage that, and then I'm going to play that melody an octave down again, and let's see how this behaves here. Okay, so while we were recording, we did hear that previous melody that we did, and the new performance was added. And then also, as you can see here, we have a layer that has been added. Now, if we come back to the beginning again, I'm going to play another octave down and just record, still in takes to layers. So you can see clearly what's going on here. We are getting additional layers of each performance being added to our original track. And the last recording is going to be what we have focused in our original track. The others will be pushed down, although we can move those up to the original track by clicking this arrow here. So if we wanted to hear that previous take then, or the previous recording, we can just hit this up arrow, push that to the front, come back to the beginning and play back. If we would like to hear that last one, then I'll press the up arrow here at the bottom for layer 3. Start from the beginning. Okay, so we're just going to continue to add layers as we record over the original track, and then that will allow us to do as many takes as we'd like to get the sound that we want or the performance that we want, and it's going to mix them together. Now, along with this up arrow to push our previous performances to the main track, we can also delete a layer by clicking the X here. We can also duplicate that layer by clicking there. If we'd like to solo a layer to just hear back what we've already recorded without pushing it up to the top, we can then use the solo buttons here. We can also click this button there to access the color palette and change the color of our event. We can double click on the layer name there to rename it to help us remember what that particular take was. And along with this up arrow to kind of push these layers up to the top, we can also click on this icon here in the bottom left corner of our event and then choose a layer to play back. Now I'm going to go ahead and push this layer 2 up to the top and delete out these other two, because now we want to take a look at, well, what happens if we use replace in tandem with takes to layers. I'll go ahead and start back from the beginning and record here. Okay, notice that we did not hear that previous recording, and we have that layer that has been added. That's because we have takes to layers selected. And if I come back to the beginning of the track and then record another pass through playing an octave up, okay, now see, we have an additional layer. So basically what we're doing is recording over the existing MIDI performance and adding that as a new layer. So this way we're starting from scratch, but then keeping all of it in separate layers that we can then push to the top and then choose the best that we would like to use. Now, if you notice here, our icon has changed into a bracket here. So if I come out, we have our arrow icon in the bottom right hand corner, but as I hover over these events within the different layers, it's changed to a bracket. We can actually click, hold, and drag to select a portion of the event within these other layers to push that up to the top, so we can choose pieces of each layer to use in our main performance up above here. Now, this works a bit better, I think, for audio if we're recording audio takes into separate layers, but just know that this is available for your MIDI takes. And if you have Snap engaged here by clicking this icon or pressing in on your computer keyboard, this is going to snap. So some of these MIDI notes may not start directly on, say, bar 2. This actually begins a bit in bar 1. So if I click, hold, and drag to select that, then we're not going to have that note, because as you can see here, that note actually begins a bit in the end of bar 1 here. But just know that you do have the option to click, hold, and drag and choose different portions of the layers below to get the MIDI performances that you want into one track at the top here. I'll go ahead and Control Z to undo. One of the benefits of recording in these different layers is that we can keep our original routing and effects devices on this original track and just use these different performances without having to set up separate tracks and go through the process of routing them and adding the effects that we're using here. So if I press F4 on this, we can see that I have a room reverb on this piano. So instead of setting up an additional track and adding another presence, adding the room reverb, we can simply do these performances, set them up to go to different takes, and then choose the one that we'd like to use. So it's kind of a time saver, along with being able to choose the different parts here that we'd like to use. I'll go ahead and press F4 to close out the inspector, and let me Control Z to get rid of that part, and I'll close out these different layers. And then let's go ahead and deselect these and move on to our instrument loop record. And for this example, I'm actually going to bring in an impact. So I'll press F6 and open up the Instruments tab, expand out that Personas folder, and bring in our impact to a new track. I'll close out that browser, and I'm going to choose this acoustic kit. And before we move on to looking at the loop record features here, I'm going to engage the input quantize. And we didn't talk about that anyway, so we'll cover it here. In order to capture the audio from Studio One for these tutorials, I need to use my Windows audio drivers, which means I do have a fair amount of latency when I'm playing back on my MIDI controller. So I'm going to go ahead and engage the input quantize. And basically, this is going to automatically snap your MIDI performance, your MIDI notes, to whatever quantize value that you have set up above here. Now I've got quarter notes. I think that that will be fine for the basic drum beat that we're going to be creating in a second here. And just notice that this input quantize icon ties in with the input quantize within the record panel. So if I disengage here, it's disengaged up top. And if I click here, we can see that it's activated below here. Okay, now by default within the instrument loop record mix is going to be active. So let's just go ahead and start with seeing how that's going to behave when we record our loop. I'll go ahead and click at the beginning of bar 5 and press the / on my keyboard to engage our loop here and start recording. Okay, so as I'm sure most of you expected with record mix on, when we're using loop recording as engaged up above here, it's going to mix all of the notes together within the performance. So I'm going to go ahead and just select this MIDI part here that we just recorded and delete that out. Come back to the beginning of our track and let's switch to record takes and see how this behaves here. I'll go ahead and start recording. Okay, notice that on that second pass through, we didn't hear our bass drum, only the snare that we were actively recording. And you may be wondering, well, where are the takes? When we were recording our piano part, we had those show up immediately below. Well, we don't have takes to layers active. So that is why we are not seeing those, but they are there. If you notice this little icon here, if I click that, we can see that our takes are here. So take 1 is our bass drum, take 2 is our snare. So if I go ahead and play back here, that's our snare. If I click here to take 1, we have our bass drum. So, and you're not just limited to having to choose between these different takes. We can actually right click on this MIDI part and then choose Unpack Tape, unpack the takes. And we have several different options. We can unpack the takes to separate tracks, to new layers, or to existing layers. So if we just choose to new layers, to get a similar example as we saw with the piano, then we can see we have the same functionality available. We can get rid of these layers by clicking on the X. We can duplicate, we can solo, we can change the MIDI part color, we can double click and rename, and we can also push these up to the top track here. And just keep in mind that if you use this method, then you're only going to be able to hear one take at a time, as we saw with the piano recordings. So if you'd prefer to have your drum takes each one audible, then you'd really want to unpack them to tracks. So I'll Control Z and undo that. Right click on our MIDI part and then come to Unpack Takes and choose Unpack Takes to tracks. Now we can see that the drum and snare are on separate tracks that we can then play back both at the same time. Although we do need to direct this to our impact. And now we're in business. And I'm just going to go ahead and Control Z and also delete this MIDI part here and just go one more time through this with the takes to layers active. And okay, and now we can see with the takes to layers active here in the record mode, those are going to be automatically separated out into our different layers. And I'm just going to go ahead and delete those out, as well as our MIDI part here. And what do I want to do? I'll disengage the takes to layers, and I want to do record mix, because now we're going to move on to the instrument recording tools. We have undo last loop, undo all loops, note repeat, and note erase. We'll start with undo last loop. So this is probably obvious. If I go ahead and record our bass and snare again, I'll start with one pass of the bass, and then on the second pass, I'll add the snare. And now our snare. So at this point, while it's still recording, it's important to know that this only works while it's still recording. We can undo the last loop, which will take out our snare. Now we have three different takes there going on, or takes, so to speak. We also have undo all loops. So if I click that, then we get rid of everything. And just remember that we need to still be in record mode, because once we stop, we're not going to have that these two available to us. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Now next we have note repeat, and this actually has some issues to it. There are some bugs, unless I'm just doing something incorrectly, but I have seen online other people are having some issues. But the note repeat is, as it says, will allow us to repeat our notes. You do need to be either in playback or record in order for this to work. So if I go ahead and start playback, just note that this is going to make use of whatever your quantized value is. So we're on quarter note. I'll change this to 16th note, start playback, and I'm going to trigger my hat. So I'm just triggering this on my MIDI controller. All I have to do is press the pad, and we have that 16th note repeat. I'll go ahead and engage record. Okay, now we can see that this is recorded as it sounds, and this is part of the issue. Depending on when you trigger your pad, it's going to create notes that are actually a bit shorter than the 16th note value or longer. So if I select one note and then push that up, we can see that that note is a bit longer than the 16th note value. I'll go ahead and F2 to close out the editor there. Now, the other issue that I've noticed with the note repeat is that we have these other two fields here where we can essentially click here and manually enter in a note, say C2, D2, whatever we'd like, and use that to trigger or turn on the note repeat so that we don't have to press this on and off to activate this feature. So if I just click in this field here, I'll press a key on my keyboard. That's going to fill that in. With F2, I'll press enter. Now that has been accepted. And in theory, I should be able to press F2 on my keyboard to activate note repeat. And that way, when you're recording your drums back live, you can just press the key and then use your pad. And it's going to be a bit simpler than having to grab your mouse, in theory, to activate the note repeat. But as you can see, this doesn't work. Now, if I just select there, I'll put a dash in and press enter to get rid of that. If I come to the erase key and then press F2, press enter to accept that, and then press F2 again, we can see that note erase does become active when I press F2 on my keyboard controller. Now, this is how note erase or note repeat should function as far as I'm aware, but for some reason it does not. And this has been an issue for quite a while now, so I'm not sure why that hasn't been corrected. But if I'm doing something wrong, leave a comment below and let me know. And since we have that active, note erase basically is going to, let me start from the beginning, delete out that, start record. Okay, now I'm going to press F2 on my MIDI controller and activate that note erase, and we'll see that we can get rid of the snare by, I'm just basically pressing the snare pad on my keyboard while I'm holding down the F2 key, and then we activate the note erase and we can erase different notes on here. So I'll get rid of that bass. So we can take our notes out individually like that. We can just also hold down the pad and get rid of, say if we have a lot of hi-hats in succession on 8th notes or 16th notes, then you can just press and hold that pad while note erase is engaged and get rid of that. Maybe if you wanted to get rid of one particular note, this is going to be more efficient than having to do undo last loop or undo all loops. And so that's it for the record panel. We have one last MIDI recording method to take a look at, and that's going to be step record. So I'm actually going to delete that out, and let's see, we'll come back to our, I'm going to take the impact out of here and remove this track by holding Shift T. I'm going to delete this MIDI part 2, double click to add one in, and double click that to open up our editor. Now this icon represents the step record, so it is off by default. All we need to do to activate is click once, and these are the step record controls. Starting from the very left here, we have enable, and that is engaged by default. So this basically is going to arm, so to speak, the step record for you to do that. And step record basically allows you to input MIDI notes without being in real-time record. So since this is enabled, if I come back to the beginning of our song, our cursor is here at the beginning of bar 1. All I need to do is press a key on my MIDI controller, and you can see that that note has been put in. I'll press another and keep going, and you can see that these are being inputted in manually one at a time. Now these are being added according to the value that we have chose here. This is going to follow our quantize value set above. So if I change this to a half note, then we can see that this changes. If I come to an eighth note, then we can see that that changes there. We can also disengage follow quantize and then choose, say, this quarter note, and then select half up here. Then we see we have no adjustment being made below here. Now these next will determine the type of note that we have, how this is going to be affected. So right now we have straight, so we're just going to get a straight quarter note. This is going to give us our straight eighth note. We can also choose triplet, and if I press there, we get a triplet. We've got quintole, septole, and dotted. Now back is basically kind of like undo, so we go back one note, and it undoes the last notes that we've inputted. If we'd like to add a rest, so if I choose a half note, say I'd want a half rest, then we can choose the half note there, click the rest, and we move ahead by a half note. And triplet is engaged, so that's why why that looks like that. I'll go back one, click on rest, and then triplet was re-engaged when I hit back. We'll get this together here. Okay, now we've got a half note rest. And you can also add chords in. It doesn't have to be individual notes. And so that is how the step record works. And so we've been working with very simplistic melodies and beats here just to give you an idea of how these different methods function. I hope that this has been a clear presentation, and that if you had any questions or were having issues with the different methods of recording your MIDI, that this clears things up. If not, leave a comment below with your question, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. Take care.